The stage pulled into Hays City, Kansas, on a Tuesday in late October of 1873, and the woman who tumbled out of it hit the ground before anyone could catch her. She did not cry out. That was the first thing Ira Turner noticed as he stood near the post office with a bundle of wire and a pair of work gloves tucked under his arm. Any other woman would have screamed, or at the very least gasped, when she went down like that onto the packed red dirt of the main street. But this one made no sound at all beyond the soft thud of her body and the quick, controlled exhale that told him she had been hurt somewhere that made noise too costly a thing. He crossed the street in 3 long strides. Up close she was something else entirely. Dark hair pinned in a way that was coming undone, a gray wool traveling dress that had seen better days, and a face that was beautiful, yes, but that was not what stopped him. What stopped him were her eyes, which were the deep green of river water, and which were wide open and furious in a way that made it very clear she did not want pity. She was already trying to get up. "Easy," he said, and he crouched down without touching her, laying his bundle in the dirt. He kept his voice at the register men used with spooked horses low, unhurried, entirely without alarm. "You hit a stone or something in the road. Take a breath." She looked at him as though calculating whether he was a threat. He had dark eyes and an honest face, square-jawed and sun-darkened the way men got who worked land for a living, and he held himself perfectly still while she performed her assessment. "I am fine," she said, and the words came out clipped, each one bitten short, her jaw working in a way that seemed effortful. "You are on the ground," he pointed out, but without judgment. "Briefly," she said. Despite himself, despite everything, he almost smiled. He did not. He simply extended his hand palm up and waited, making no move to grab or lift or haul, just offering the thing and letting her decide. She looked at his hand for a moment. Then she placed hers in it. He helped her to standing and felt the way she braced and went still when her right side bore any weight, the subtle hitch in her breathing, the flex of something controlled and deliberate around her ribs. He had worked cattle long enough to recognize pain being managed rather than absent, but he did not remark on it. He simply kept his grip steady until she had her footing. "Thank you," she said. The words were polite but came through her teeth as though full jaw movement was something she was rationing. "Ira Turner," he said. "I run the quarter section north of town, cattle mostly." She looked at him another moment. "Nellie Thatcher." "You have people here in Hays City, Miss Thatcher." Something moved through those green eyes. Not quite grief, not quite anger. Something that contained both. "No," she said. "I came looking for work." Hays City in 1873 was a town finding its identity. The cattle drives had made it famous and somewhat notorious. The railroad had made it permanent. It had a post office now, and a land office, 2 churches, a schoolhouse under construction, and enough respectable commerce to attract families alongside the rougher elements that had always made it a place where a woman traveling alone might find herself in difficulty. Ira Turner knew this. He had seen 3 different women arrive in the territory in the last 2 years, each with something hard and unspoken behind their eyes. He picked up his bundle of wire from the dirt. "Mrs. Calver runs a boarding house on the south end of Water Street," he said. "She takes in women doing domestic work. Good woman, fair rates, and she does not ask questions that are not her business." Nellie Thatcher regarded him steadily. "That is a notable recommendation," she said, "for somewhere you are sending a stranger." "Well," he said, and this time he did allow something close to a smile, brief and careful. "It tends to be where I send people who look like they need somewhere safe before they need anything else." She held his gaze for just a moment, and the thing he saw in her face in that moment was not gratitude exactly. It was something more complicated. It was the look of a person who has been making careful calculations about the world for long enough that an act of simple decency had become almost disorienting. "Water Street," she said. "South End. Big green shutters you cannot miss." She nodded once. Picked up the carpet bag that had landed beside her in the street, and which was, he noticed, her only luggage. Then she walked in the direction he had indicated, and she walked without limping, though he could see the price of it in the set of her shoulders. He stood in the street and watched until she was around the corner. Then he picked up his wire and walked back toward the livery where his horse was hitched, and he thought about Nellie Thatcher and her locked jaw and her fury and her green eyes for the remainder of the day. He told himself he would not think about her the day after that. He was wrong about that. He stopped in at Mrs. Calver's boarding house 3 days later under the pretense of asking Martha Calver whether she needed any cord would split before winter, which was a genuine question, but also not the only reason he came. Martha Calver was a sharp-eyed woman of 50 who had been his mother's friend, and who knew him well enough to read the situation the moment he came through her front door. "She is here," Martha said, before he could ask, "working in the kitchen. She is quiet and she keeps to herself, and she has not told me one thing about where she came from, but I like her just fine." "Is she well?" Martha studied him. "She is moving more freely than she was when she arrived. Whatever ails her ribcage seems to be improving, but she still barely opens her jaw past a certain point, and she winces when she thinks no one is looking." Ira nodded. "Good that she has somewhere to rest." "She could use more than rest," Martha said carefully. "She could use someone to trust." He looked at Martha. "That is her business, not mine." Martha Calver gave him the look she had been giving him since he was 12 years old, the look that said she knew exactly what he was thinking and that he should not bother pretending otherwise. "I split wood on Saturdays," he said. "I know you do," said Martha. "He came back on Saturday." Nellie Thatcher was in the side yard hanging laundry when he arrived with his axe. She had her sleeves rolled to her elbows and her hair pinned back, and she was working with a concentrated efficiency that he recognized as the movement of someone who had learned to compensate for an injury over a long period of time. She moved the weight of the wet sheets through her left side mostly, using her right arm only for the pinning, and she had arranged the basket in a way that minimized how far she had to reach or bend. She heard him come around the side of the house and looked up. "Mr. Turner," she said. There was no particular warmth in it, but there was no wariness either. More like the neutral acknowledgement of a fact. "Miss Thatcher." He tipped his hat and went to the wood pile without fuss. He split wood for 2 hours. She finished the laundry, went inside, came back out with a pot of beans to sort on the back step and sorted them. He could hear the creak of the step and the sound of dried beans clicking against one another. Neither of them spoke. Eventually he stopped to wipe his face with his sleeve, and she said without looking up from the beans, "You do not talk much." "When there is something to say," he said. She considered this. "People around here want to know things." "People everywhere want to know things," he said. "That does not mean they are entitled to them." She looked up then, and the look on her face was the same complicated thing he had seen in the street on the first day, that slight disorientation of someone for whom simple decency had become unexpected. "No," she said quietly. "I suppose they are not." He went back to chopping. She went back to her beans. But she was on the back step when he stacked the last of the split wood, and she had a cup of coffee waiting that she had brought out without making a scene of it, just set it on the rail of the fence within his reach, and he picked it up and drank it and said, "Thank you," and she nodded once like it was nothing much. It was not nothing much, he knew that. He came back the following Saturday and the one after that. By the third Saturday it had become something understood without being stated. He arrived, he worked. She was somewhere nearby doing her own work, and they talked when they felt like it. There was a quality to those silences that he found he looked forward to more than most conversations. They were not empty silences. They were the kind that meant both people were paying attention. The jaw thing, he noticed, was gradually improving. By the end of October she was speaking in longer sentences, opening her mouth more fully, though she still had a habit of touching the left side of her face briefly when something hurt, a touch so quick he thought she was probably unaware she did it. He did not ask. He brought her a book one Saturday in early November, a Harper's Weekly from his subscription, rolled up in his coat pocket. He had remembered her glancing at the stack of papers on Martha Calver's parlor table the week before with the look of someone who was hungry for reading material, but felt odd about asking. She took the magazine and looked at it and then looked at him. "I read them twice already," he said simply. Seemed wasteful to let them stack up. She turned it in her hands. "I used to have quite a library," she said, and then she stopped as though she had not quite intended to say that much. He made no reaction, just picked up his axe. She stood there a moment. "My father had a good collection, legal texts mostly, but some literature." "Was he a lawyer?" "He was." She paused. "He died last spring." "I am sorry," Ira said, and he was, and his voice said exactly that, nothing more. "He was a good man." Her voice was steady but had something fragile at the core of it. "He was the best man I knew." Something about the way she said that, the phrasing of it, the best man I knew, not the best man in my life, made him pay closer attention, but he did not press. "My father was a good man too," he said. "He homesteaded this land in '67, died of fever in '69. I have been running the place since I was 23. She looked at him. "How old are you now?" 28, he said. "You?" A brief hesitation, as though she were calculating whether to answer. 26. He nodded. Went back to his chopping. She sat down on the back step with her Harper's Weekly and did not leave until he was done, and when he passed her on his way out she looked up and said, "Thank you for the magazine, Mr. Turner." "Ira," he said. A pause. Something moved across her face. "Ira," she repeated, and the sound of his name in her voice did something to the inside of his chest that he found he had to breathe through. November came in cold and serious that year. The wind off the open plains had a cutting quality by the second week, and the sky over Hayes City went the color of old iron most mornings and stayed that way. Ira had his hands full with his cattle, bringing the herd closer to shelter, checking his fencing, laying in supplies before the first real freeze made the roads difficult. He had a hand named Caleb Pratt who worked the place with him, a reliable man of 40 who had been with him for 3 years, and together they worked from first light until there was no more daylight to work by. He still came to Martha's on Saturdays. One Saturday in mid-November, he arrived to find that Martha Calver had gone to visit her sister in Salina, and that Nellie Thatcher was alone in the house, managing everything. He came around the side of the house expecting the usual rhythm of things, and found her instead sitting on the back step with her hands in her lap and her face tilted up to the cold gray sky, and an expression on her face that was the closest thing to desolate he had ever seen on a person who was clearly trying very hard not to look desolate. She heard him and straightened. "Mrs. Calver is away," she said, in the tone of someone reporting facts. "I know," he said. "She mentioned it last week. I thought I would still come and split the wood." She looked at him for a moment. "You do not have to do that when she is not here." "The wood still needs splitting," he said. She was quiet. "Then I could make some coffee while you work." "That would be fine," he said. He chopped wood and she made coffee, and when he was done she brought 2 cups out instead of 1, and she sat on the back step and he sat on the fence rail across from her, and they drank their coffee and looked at the flat gray sky together. "Do you ever miss home?" she asked after a long while. "I am home," he said. "Yes," she said. "I suppose that is the difference." He looked at her. "Where is home for you?" She turned the cup in her hands. "Missouri," she said. "A town called Carver's Crossing, small place, not much to it." "You have family there?" The long pause, the shift of her face. "I had a husband there," she said. Ira waited. "He is the reason I left," she said, and her voice was perfectly controlled and perfectly flat, and that flatness was itself a kind of testimony. He did not ask anything. He looked at the sky, drank his coffee. After a moment she said, "My father died in March. He was the only person who would have helped me." Her voice wavered on that sentence just once and then was steady again. "After he died, there was no reason to stay and considerable reason to go, so I got on a stage." He looked at her then carefully. She was looking at her cup. "I had enough money to get to Hayes City," she said. "I had heard there was work here. I thought if I could get somewhere no one knew me, somewhere I could start with only what I was and not what I was attached to, then maybe," she stopped. "Then maybe things could be different," he said. She looked up, met his eyes. "Yes," she said, "something like that." He nodded once slowly. He wanted to ask about the ribs. He wanted to ask about the jaw. He wanted to ask about the husband in Missouri and what kind of man he had been and whether she was free of him legally or only geographically. He asked none of it. He finished his coffee and put the cup on the step beside hers and said, "You are different things already, Nellie Thatcher. I can tell that much just from knowing you these few weeks." She stared at him as though he had said something unexpected in a language she was still learning. "You barely know me," she said at last. "I know you split a cord of wood one-handed in October without complaining, and you read Harper's weekly cover to cover twice before I brought you a new one," he said. "And you brought me coffee that you did not have to bring." Something happened to her face then. Something cracked open very slightly, like the first breath of warm air through a frozen window pane. She looked away quickly, but not before he saw it. December came, and with it the first real snow of the season, light but persistent, turning the streets of Hayes City to mud and then to something colder. The cattle drives were long done for the year and the town had gone quieter, the rougher elements having moved on to wherever those elements went when the drovers stopped coming through. What remained was the working population, the families, the business owners, the farmers and ranchers and the people who served them. Ira came into town twice a week through December, once for supplies and once for no particular reason, except that his quarter section was very quiet in winter, and he had discovered that there was a coffee cup left out on Martha Calver's fence post every Saturday morning. He discovered it the third Saturday of December when he arrived and found Nellie already in the side yard, turned away from him, working on something, and the cup sitting there on the post rail in the cold as though it had been there since first light. He stood for a moment and looked at that cup, just a tin cup, still warm, steam rising in the cold air, left out without ceremony or announcement. Left out with the same quiet deliberateness with which she did everything. He picked it up and drank it and stood in the cold while the steam of his own breath mixed with the steam of the coffee. She came around from the other side of the yard and saw that he had the cup. She did not make a fuss about it, just said, "There is more inside if you want it when you are done." "Thank you," he said. He chopped wood. She brought him a second cup when the first was gone. They talked about the weather, about the town council's ongoing argument regarding the new schoolhouse, about a book she had found on Martha's shelf, a novel by Thomas Hardy, and whether the characters in it could have done anything differently or whether they had been defeated by circumstance from the start. "I think they had choices," she said firmly. "I think it is more comforting to say that tragedy is inevitable, but I do not believe it is." He thought about that. "You think people can always find a way out?" "I think people can always find a way forward," she said. "It is not the same thing." He looked at her over his axe handle. She was looking at him directly, her chin slightly lifted, those green eyes clear and serious in the winter light. "That is an important distinction," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have had cause to think about it." He did not press, but after that he thought about her words all the way home through the snow-soft silence of the prairie, and he thought they were among the most honest words anyone had ever said to him. Christmas was a modest affair in Hayes City in 1873. The two churches held services, and there was a gathering at the town hall with music and food brought by various families. Martha Calver attended with Nellie, and Ira was there with Caleb Pratt and Caleb's wife, me, a solid woman with a good laugh who immediately took to Nellie with a warmth that made something in Ira's chest feel easier. He danced with Nellie twice. The first time was because Pratt had essentially maneuvered them together with cheerful determination, and the second time was because he asked her himself, quietly, when the fiddle player started a slower piece, and the overhead lanterns made everything soft and warm. She hesitated before accepting. He could see her calculating something. "I will not hold you tighter than is comfortable," he said, very quietly. "And I will steer clear of your right side." The look she gave him then was somewhere between startled and careful. He was the first person besides Martha who had acknowledged that she was hurt, and he had done it without making a thing of it, without pity, without questions. "All right," she said. They danced, and he kept his word. He held her gently and let her set the proximity, and she moved with him with a careful grace that made it clear she had once danced easily and freely, and the knowledge that she was dancing carefully now made him more tender with her than he had words for. She looked up at him once during the dance, not coquettishly, just a direct, honest look. "You are a good man, Ira Turner," she said. He did not know what to say to that. He said, "I try to be." "Trying counts for a great deal," she said. He brought her back to where me was standing, and he spent the rest of the evening talking to people and pretending he was not thinking about how her hand had felt in his and the way she had smelled of wood smoke and lavender soap. He was not very convincing, even to himself. January came in hard. A 3-day blizzard shut the roads in the first week of the new year, 1874, and Ira was cut off on his quarter section with Caleb and spent 3 days repairing fences inside the barn and reading by lamplight and thinking, if he was honest, mostly about Nellie. When the roads opened, he rode into town faster than he had any practical reason to and went straight to Martha Calver's. And when Martha opened the door and he asked whether everything was well, Martha Calver looked at him with her sharp 50-year-old eyes and said, "We are both fine, Ira. She has been asking after the road conditions." He stood in Martha's parlor with his hat in his hand and felt suddenly like an extremely transparent man. "She has been asking about you," Martha said more gently. He went through to the kitchen where Nellie was standing at the stove. She heard him come in and turned, and when she saw him something moved very fast across her face, relief and something warmer than relief, and then she pulled her expression into her usual composed order. "The roads are clear," she said. "They are," he said. "You should have waited another day. It was still dangerous this morning." "Probably," he agreed. She turned back to the stove and stirred something with more concentration than it required. "I made a beef stew," she said. "There is enough for 3. He took off his coat and hung it on the peg by the door and sat down at Martha's kitchen table, and that was, he thought later, the moment things shifted. Not dramatically, not with any declaration. It was simply that he sat down at the table and she set a bowl in front of him, and it felt so natural that it ached. They ate with Martha and talked about the blizzard and the state of the roads and Caleb Pratt's opinion on the spring cattle market. And Nellie told a story about a neighbor in Missouri who had survived a worse blizzard by sheltering in his corn crib for 4 days. And she told it with a dry humor that made both Ira and Martha laugh. And when she laughed, her whole face changed, opened up, became something that he thought could power a room. He did not go home until after dark. Riding back under the cold stars, he faced himself plainly. He was in love with Nellie Thatcher. He had been for some time. And she was carrying something she had not told him, something large and serious and tied to a man in Missouri. And until she was ready to tell him, he would do nothing about what he felt, because the last thing she needed was another man making demands of her. But he knew what he knew. February brought a thaw and the smell of mud and possibility. The new schoolhouse was nearly finished. There was talk of a new general store opening in the spring. Hayes City was growing into itself, finding the balance between its rougher past and its permanent future. Nellie had been offered a position as assistant to the town's only doctor, a man named Dr. Horace Wellman, who was overworked and aging and badly needed someone with a steady hand and a quick mind. She had a working knowledge of medicinal herbs from her father, who had picked it up as a boy from the older women in his Missouri community. And she had a composure under difficult circumstances that Wellman had apparently recognized immediately. She told Ira about it on a Saturday in February, sitting on the back step of Martha's in the first warm sunlight of the year, her face turned up to it. "It is only part days," she said. "Mornings mostly, but it is work I know how to do." "That is good news," he said, and he meant it fully. She looked at her hands. It feels like something being built," she said, "which is a feeling I had forgotten." He looked at her profile in the sunlight. The line of her jaw, which had eased considerably since October, the curve of her mouth, the way she seemed, in moments like this, to be slowly becoming some fuller version of herself. "Nellie," he said, She looked at him. He had not planned what came next. He had specifically told himself he was not going to say anything until she was ready to say something first. But he was 28 years old, and it was February, and the sun was warm, and she was sitting 3 feet away and looking at him with those green eyes. "I would like to come see you," he said, "not just on Saturdays and not just to split wood. I would like to come see you properly if that is something you want." She held his gaze for a long moment. Something complicated moved through her face. He waited without flinching. "You do not know everything about me," she said. "I know enough to know that I want to," he said. She was quiet. He let her be quiet. "I am not free," she said at last, and the words came out with difficulty as though they cost her something. "Not technically, not legally. I left him, but I did not. There was no formal separation. I did not have the means or the time to arrange one. I just left. There it was." The shape of the thing finally visible. He did not react with shock or with judgment. He thought about what it meant in practical terms, and he thought about what it meant for her, and then he said, "There are lawyers in Abilene, men who handle these matters. If you wanted to pursue it, it could be done." She stared at him. "Just like that?" "Not just like that," he said honestly. "It would take time and money and possibly some difficulty, but it can be done. Women in the territories have obtained legal separations before." She was very still. "I have not spoken about this to anyone," she said. "Not to Martha, not to anyone." "You are speaking to me," he said. She turned away, looked at the yard, the bare winter grass, the fence. He could see her shoulders rise and fall. "His name is Clyde Farrow," she said. "I was Nellie Farrow for 3 years." She paused. "My father did not know what he was before we married. I did not know. He was careful in his courtship. He became less careful after." Ira said nothing. Listened. "He was not violent in the way that you would think of violence," she said, and her voice was careful and measured in the way that people use when they have rehearsed a thing in their heads many times but never actually said it aloud. "He was violent in the way of sustained and specific pressure. He knew exactly how much force was required to damage and exactly how to apply it so that the damage was not visible. He was a precise man." Ira's hands on the fence rail were very still. "The rib," she said, "was from October. He was angry about my father's estate. My father left his property to me, not to Clyde. Clyde considered that an insult." She paused. He had broken ribs before. He knew how it was done. The controlled flatness in her voice was the most eloquent testimony he had ever heard. "And the jaw?" he asked gently, because he understood now that she was telling him and that the telling required witnesses. "The week before I left," she said. "He realized I was planning something. He did not know what. He was trying to frighten me into staying still." She touched the side of her face, that quick involuntary touch, and seemed to notice she was doing it this time. Lowered her hand deliberately. "Dr. Wellman says the joint was likely fractured. It has healed well, but there will always be some tightness." Ira looked at the flat blue winter sky. He thought about Clyde Farrow in Missouri, who was still legally Nellie's husband, who was a precise man. He felt something cold and quiet move through him, nothing like rage, more like absolute clarity. "You are safe here," he said. "Hays City is 2 days' hard ride from the Missouri border, and no reasonable man would follow a woman this far west just to continue managing her. He wanted control, and she is gone. That is how it works." She looked at him sharply. "You know this kind of man." "I have seen this kind before," he said carefully. "I grew up not far from a family with a man of that kind. The leaving is usually enough. They do not want the woman, they want the submission. Once you are gone, they find someone else to manage." She absorbed this. "The leaving had to be enough," she said. "It was all I had." "It was everything," he said. "It was right." She was looking at him so directly it felt like something physical. "Ira," she said, "yes. I would like to try what you said, coming to see me properly." She said it with the careful exactness of someone negotiating treaty terms, not because she was cold, but because she was being precise about something that mattered. "I need it to be slow. I need to do it in the way that feels like I am choosing." "It will be entirely in the way you choose," he said. "Every part of it." Something in her face broke open again, wider this time, that thaw window feeling, and she pressed her lips together for a moment and nodded. "All right," she said. "Then yes." He smiled, and it was not the careful almost smile he had been giving her for months. It was a full, honest, wide-open smile, and he watched it hit her like first light. Spring came to the Kansas territory like a slow announcement. The mud of March gave way to the stubborn green of April, and by May the prairie was in full unfolding, the tall grass coming in gold green and the wildflowers that had no names in any language but Cheyenne and Pawnee running in bright seams across the hills. Ira took Nellie out to his land for the first time in April. He came for her on a Sunday morning with 2 horses, one of which was a patient gray mare named Fern that he had specifically selected for her gentleness, and they rode out of Hays City on a morning that smelled of new grass and distant rain. She was a confident rider, which did not surprise him. She rode without self-consciousness, upright in the saddle, her face open to the wind in a way he had not yet seen, something close to joy. He watched her and felt the particular kind of happiness that lives very close to grief, the kind that comes from recognizing that someone has been starved of something ordinary, and that ordinary thing is now being restored. He showed her the land. The quarter section that had been his father's and was now his, the cattle moving in the distance, the creek that ran along the north boundary, the oak tree that stood alone on the eastern rise like a landmark from the old world. "It is beautiful," she said, and she said it simply, without romance or performance. "It is good land," he agreed. "It will grow things if you treat it right." She looked at the open sweep of it. "What does it feel like," she said, "to own something that was your family's?" To have that continuity, he thought about it honestly. "It feels like responsibility," he said, "and like belonging, both at the same time." "I think I would like that," she said quietly. The belonging part. He looked at her. She was looking out at the land, and there was something in her expression that was both longing and hope, and those are not always the same direction, but in her face they pointed the same way. "Nellie," he said. She turned to him. He leaned across the distance between their horses and kissed her, very gently, very briefly, and she let him, and when he pulled back she was looking at him with those clear green eyes in the May morning light. "All right," she said, and it was the 3rd time she had said that to him, and each time it had meant something larger. They rode back to town in the early afternoon, and he held her hand for part of the way, their horses close together, the prairie running out in all directions around them like a promise. He spoke to a lawyer in Abilene that same month, a man named Preston Holt, who had handled several separation cases in the territory, and who confirmed what Ira had told Nellie, that it was possible, that it would take time, that it would require legal notices to be sent to Missouri, and that the outcome would depend in part on whether Clyde Farrow chose to contest it. Holt was a careful man who asked the right questions without embellishment. When Ira described the injuries that Nellie had arrived with and which were documented in Dr. Wellman's records, Holt's expression tightened. "She has grounds," Holt said. "Cruelty. It is recognized in Kansas territorial law. If she wishes to pursue it, we have a strong case." Ira paid Holt a retainer out of his own pocket and rode home, and did not tell Nellie how he had paid for it. He told her only that he had spoken with a lawyer, that there was a path forward, and that it was her choice whether to take it. She chose to take it. The legal process was slow and periodically uncomfortable. The notice sent to Missouri came back with no response for 6 weeks, and when the response arrived it was a single letter in Clyde Farrow's handwriting, which Nellie read alone in Martha's parlor, and which she burned in the kitchen stove afterward without discussing its contents. Whatever it said, she came out of Martha's parlor with her chin up and her eyes very clear and said to Ira, who was waiting in the kitchen, "He is not coming. He does not want the fight. He wants it to be over as much as I do." The relief in her voice was a sound he would carry for the rest of his life. The legal separation was finalized in July of 1874. Preston Holt sent the papers to Dr. Wellman's office in Hays City, where Nellie was working, and she held them for a long time before signing her name. When she signed Nellie Thatcher. Ira was with her. Martha Calver was there too, and Dr. Wellman, who had become something of a guardian figure in the months since she had come to work for him. They opened a bottle of wine that Wellman had been saving since the previous Christmas, and they toasted in the dusty office with its shelves of medical supplies and its smell of dried herbs. Nellie cried. Just briefly, just once, pressing her fingers to the bridge of her nose and then exhaling and being composed again. But he saw it, and he put his arm around her carefully on her left side, and she leaned into him and stayed there for a moment. "Free," she said. "Free," he agreed. She looked up at him, and the thing in her face in that moment was something he had never seen on anyone before, not exactly. It was the look of a person who has walked through something very long and very dark and come out on the other side into light, and the light is so new they are still learning how to see by it. He kissed her forehead. She held his hand all the way back to Martha's boarding house, and at the gate she turned to him. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask me anything," he said. "Is there a place on your land where things might be built?" she said. "Not just cattled and fenced, a proper house. Gardens, maybe." He looked at her. "The east rise near the oak tree," he said slowly. "There is a flat stretch there that faces south, gets the morning light." "Good for a garden," she said. "South-facing." "Very good for a garden," he said, and his voice had gone very quiet. She met his eyes. "I am asking you plainly," she said, "because I want everything between us to be plain." "Then I will answer you plainly," he said. "Yes. I would build you a house near that oak tree and a garden on the south-facing slope and whatever else you want. And I would do it because I love you and I want you to stay." She took a breath. "I love you too," she said, and it came out clear and certain as a bell note on cold air. "I have for some time, and I have been afraid to say it." He closed the distance between them and kissed her, and she kissed him back with the full, present warmth of a woman who was finally saying yes to something freely. He asked Martha Calver for her blessing the following day, which made Martha cry and then pretend she had something in her eye. He asked Dr. Wellman for his opinion, because Wellman had become Nellie's closest thing to family in the territory, and Wellman said, "About time." In the dry way he said everything, which was as close to celebration as Wellman got. He asked Nellie Thatcher to marry him on the east rise of his land, under the oak tree, on a Sunday morning in August with the tall grass moving in the warm wind and the sky overhead the deep blue of summer. He had nothing theatrical prepared. He had brought a ring that had been his mother's, a simple band of gold with a small garnet, and he held it and said her name. She turned to him. He said what was in his heart, which was not many words but was all true, and she listened with her whole face. And when he was done, she said yes the way she said things, with precision and wholeness and the particular quality of someone choosing freely. They were married in October of 1874, exactly 1 year after the stage had pulled into Hayes City and Nellie had tumbled out of it into the street, and he had crossed to her in 3 long strides. The ceremony was held in the newer of the 2 churches, which was a simple building with whitewashed walls and good light through its 4 tall windows. Martha Calver was there, and Caleb and me Pratt and Dr. Wellman and a good number of the town who had come to know Nellie in her year at the doctor's office and through Martha's house. There was no family on either side to speak of. His parents were gone, and hers were gone, and they were both, in the way of the frontier, people who had come to the making of their own family late and by necessity. But the room was full and warm, and when Nellie came down the short aisle in the blue dress that me Pratt had helped her sew, she was so quietly radiant that Ira forgot how to breathe for a moment and had to recover himself. The minister was a patient man named Reverend Hicks who performed a brief and honest ceremony, and when he said they might do what they liked, Ira kissed his wife with considerable feeling, and the room applauded with what he thought was genuine pleasure. Me Pratt cried. Martha Calver did something in her eye again. Caleb Pratt shook Ira's hand with the grip of a man who meant it. Dr. Wellman said, "About time," again, which had apparently become his signature contribution to events. They celebrated in the town hall with dancing and food, and the particular warmth that comes when a community genuinely likes two people and is glad to see them happy. Ira danced with Nellie more than twice this time. He danced with her as many times as he wanted, which was often, and she danced with him freely and without careful management of her right side, the rib long since healed, the jaw moving easily and full of laughter. They rode out to the quarter section the following morning, the two of them together in the early light, the Kansas sky enormous overhead. She had her bags, more than one carpet bag now, loaded into the wagon, and there was a crate of books that Wellman had given her as a wedding gift, which she had seemed more moved by than almost anything else. The house on the East Rise was not yet built. They were living in the original homestead house, a solid two-room structure that Ira's father had built in 1867, while the new one was planned. But Nellie had already visited enough times over the summer to have opinions about the layout and the garden and the placement of the windows, and her opinions were good and practical, and he deferred to them happily. "You are the one who will spend the most time in it," he said. "We will both spend time in it," she corrected him, and there was something warm in that correction, something that said she was already thinking of the place as theirs. The first winter of their marriage was the best winter Ira Turner had ever known. The quarter section was quiet with snow, and the two of them were inside it together, and that was sufficient for him in a way that nothing had been sufficient before. She read to him in the evenings from the books Wellman had given her, and he read the papers and told her about the cattle market and what he was planning for spring, and they argued about Thomas Hardy's characters again, at length and with pleasure, neither of them changing the other's mind. She cooked and he cooked, each of them refusing to be the only one who did it, and the arguments about whose bread was better became a running joke that lasted years. She also worked, 3 mornings a week through the winter, riding into town on Fern to assist Wellman. The work suited her. She had a gift for it, a combination of steady nerves and genuine care, and the practical competence of someone who had learned, through necessity, to manage a great deal alone. Wellman was aging and beginning to talk about retirement, and she had begun to study his medical texts with a seriousness that went beyond assistance. She talked about it carefully, obliquely, not wanting to seem overreaching. "What are you thinking?" Ira asked her one evening in January, watching her read across the table. She looked up. "I am thinking about what happens when Wellman retires," she said. "There is no other doctor within 40 miles of here." "You want to do his work," he said. She held his gaze. "A woman doing that work will face difficulty," she said. "I am not pretending otherwise." "You have been doing that work for a year already," he said. "The town knows you. It is different being official." "It is different," he agreed. "But I do not think it is impossible." She looked back at her book. After a moment she said, "You never tell me what I cannot do." "That is because I have never seen you not do something you decided to do," he said. She looked at him across the table, and the warmth in her face was so full and specific it made his chest ache with the pleasure of it. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said back, as simply as she had said it, because that was how they had always been with each other. Spring came again, the second spring on the land. The house on the East Rise was begun in March, built by Ira and Caleb, and 2 men from town who took the work for fair wages. Nellie was at the site most days, supervising with a cheerful stubbornness that the hired men initially resented and then came to respect, because her specifications were correct, and her measurements were careful, and the house was better for her attention. It was finished by June, a proper house, 2 stories, with south-facing windows and a porch that looked out over the tall grass, and a kitchen garden that Nellie planted the moment the last nail was hammered in. She planted it by herself, choosing the crops with the methodical pleasure of someone designing something from scratch: kitchen herbs along the south wall, root vegetables in the middle rows, climbing beans on the eastern fence, and along the border nearest the house, flowers that she said were not practical but that she intended to have anyway. He came and found her in the dirt with her hands and her sleeves rolled up and her hair coming down, and the look on her face was the purest happiness he had seen from her yet. "It is going to be extraordinary," he said. "It is going to take work," she said. "Those are the same thing," he told her, and she laughed and threw a handful of dirt at him, which was perhaps not what a woman was supposed to do in 1875 in Kansas territory, but Nellie had never been especially concerned with what she was supposed to do. She was expecting their first child by August of 1875. She told him on a morning in early August, quietly, over coffee at the kitchen table of the new house, watching his face as she said it. He looked at her for a moment, and then he got up and came around the table and held her, carefully and completely, and she held him back, and they stayed like that for a while in the morning kitchen light. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Yes," she said honestly, "but not more than I am glad." He kissed her hair. "Me too," he said. "Both of those." She continued working with Wellman through the fall, the old doctor having made it clear that he had no intention of reducing her responsibilities just because she was with child, which was, she told Ira, one of the things she admired about him most. When she was 8 months along and the winter was setting in, Wellman sat her down and had a serious conversation about the future of his practice, which was essentially a conversation about whether she would take it over and whether the town would accept it. The conversation with the town happened in November, at a meeting of the town council, and it was not entirely without friction. There were men who had opinions. There were men whose opinions were the small, resistant kind that have nothing to do with competence and everything to do with discomfort at the unfamiliar. They expressed their opinions, and Nellie sat in that council room 8 months pregnant with her hands folded on the table, and answered every question they raised with a composure and a command of medical fact that was, by the end of the meeting, genuinely difficult to argue with. One of the council members, a man named Graves who ran the feed store, said toward the end of the meeting, "I think we ought to let the lady try it for a year and see how she gets on." It was not the most generous endorsement in the history of endorsements, but it was what passed for motion, and they voted on it and it passed. Walking out of the meeting, Nellie put her hand in Ira's arm. "A year trial," she said, with a dry amusement. "You will make them forget it was ever a question," he said. "I intend to," she said. Their son was born in December of 1875, delivered by Dr. Wellman himself in the bedroom of the house on the east rise with the snow falling outside and the fire banked high, and Ira sitting in the kitchen below with me Pratt, who had come to help, both of them pretending to drink coffee and actually just listening. When the sound from upstairs became the sound of a baby, Ira went very still. Me reached across and put her hand on his arm. A few minutes later Wellman appeared at the top of the stairs and said, "Come up." Nellie was sitting up in bed, tired and bright-eyed, holding a small bundled thing, and when Ira came through the door she looked up at him and her face was something he had no words for. "A boy," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and she gave him the baby, who was very new and very serious and who looked, Nellie said, exactly like his father. "He does not look like anything yet," Ira said, studying the small face. "He has your ears," Nellie said. "That is a fine inheritance," said Wellman from the doorway in his dry way. They named him James, which was Ira's father's name, James Theodore Turner. He had his father's dark eyes and, eventually, his mother's way of looking at people directly and saying what he meant without embellishment. The years that followed were full. Not easy. The frontier was not easy, and they would not have chosen easy if it had been offered, because easy was not the texture of the life they had built. There were hard winters and dry summers and the ordinary difficulties of cattle and land and bodies in need of doctoring. There were things they argued about and things they had to work through and moments when the weight of everything pressed down. But underneath all of it was something solid and permanent, the kind of foundation that holds because it was built carefully and with full knowledge of what it needed to carry. Nellie became the doctor of Hays City properly and fully within her first year of trial, which became a formality before it was over. The town needed her more than their reservations needed honoring, and the quality of her care made the question of her gender an increasingly difficult position to defend. She was practical and precise and genuinely gifted, and people came to her from 20 miles away, and the stories that circulated about her were the stories of her competence rather than her controversy. Graves at the feed store brought her a Christmas pie at the end of her first official year and said, without preamble, "You were right and I was cautious, and those are not the same thing and I know it." It was as close to an apology as a man of his type managed, and she accepted it at face value and gave him a piece of advice about his bad knee that improved his life considerably. Ira expanded the cattle operation gradually, with Caleb's help, adding to the herd over several years in the measured way of a man who did not want to grow faster than he could manage well. The land rewarded his care. The quarter section that had been 2 rooms and a fence became something with shape and intention. The house on the east rise visible from the road, the garden Nellie had planted growing into a permanent and abundant thing. By the summer of 1878, they had 2 children. James was 2.5, walking with enormous purpose and a great deal of noise. Their second child, born in March of 1878, was a girl they named Ruth Alice for Martha Calver, who had died peacefully in the winter of 1877, leaving a gap in both their lives that was shaped exactly like the woman who had filled it. Nellie had grieved Martha quietly and fully, the way she did everything, and had gone on carrying the pieces of her that mattered. The green shutters on the old boarding house were still visible from the south end of Water Street, which had been sold and was now a tailor's shop, and she looked at them sometimes when she rode past on her way to work. Ruth was a different creature from her brother from the first day, quieter, watchful, with Nellie's green eyes and Ira's patience. She lay in the basket in the corner of the medical office during her mother's morning hours, and observed the world with the serious attention of someone taking notes. James, meanwhile, was attempting to befriend every cow on the property, and had already been told 12 times not to go into the barn without an adult, a rule he was philosophically opposed to and which he violated regularly with expressions of complete innocence. Ira, watching his son through the kitchen window one afternoon as James conducted what appeared to be a highly serious negotiation with Fern the mare through the fence slats, felt the ordinary and enormous happiness of a life that was genuinely, actually, what he had wanted. He went out and stood at the fence beside James, who was explaining something at length to the horse. "What are you telling her?" Ira asked. "That she should not be afraid of the thunder," James said seriously. Ira looked at the clear blue sky. "It is not thundering," he pointed out. "Not now," James said. "I am telling her in advance." Ira put his hand on the back of his son's head. "That is good thinking." "Mama says it is better to prepare than to wait," James said. Ira smiled. "Your mama is right about most things." "She is right about everything," James said with the absolute certainty of a 2.5-year-old. Ira did not argue with this. The community of Hayes City continued to grow and shift through the late 1870s, and the Turners grew with it. The rough era of the cattle drives was receding, and with it, some of the wildness that had defined the territory. The railroad had brought more families, more permanence, more of the infrastructure of settled life. There were now 2 general stores, a proper schoolhouse fully operational, a newspaper that Ira read cover to cover, and that Nellie wrote letters to occasionally on subjects of medical and community interest. The schoolhouse was a matter of significant importance to both of them, though for different reasons. Nellie had spent 3 years of her marriage quietly assembling a small lending library from books she acquired through a contact in Kansas City, which she kept in the corner of her office and lent freely to anyone who came through. When the school expanded and took on a second teacher, she donated the library wholesale to the school, which made the new teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Farber, look at her with an expression of almost comical relief. Ira contributed lumber and labor to the school expansion, and Caleb Pratt contributed his opinion on every aspect of the construction, which was more thorough than anyone had asked for, but which Caleb gave freely and without apology. It was a community that was building itself out of the raw material of hard work and necessity and the ordinary willingness of people to help each other, and the Turners were both builders and beneficiaries of it. The winter of 1879 brought another pregnancy, which Nellie announced at breakfast one morning with the same directness with which she announced everything. "Third child," she said. "Spring, I think." Ira put down his coffee. "Are you well?" he asked. "Perfectly well," she said. "Eat your breakfast." He ate his breakfast, but he was smiling into his plate. She caught him at it. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I am just happy." She looked at him across the table. James was making a construction out of his bread that bore no relation to any architecture Ira had seen. Ruth was in her chair regarding her porridge with scientific interest. "I am too," Nellie said, in case that was unclear. "It was not unclear," he said, "but I like hearing it." She gave him a look that was warm and direct and thoroughly hers, and went back to her breakfast. Their third child was a boy, born in April of 1880, who they named George after nobody in particular, because they agreed that they had used the family names, and this one would simply be himself. George Turner arrived with a set of lungs that announced themselves with tremendous authority and a personality to match, and by the time he was old enough to walk, he was the loudest and most cheerful presence in any room he entered, which was the opposite of both his parents and a source of some bewilderment to them. "Where does he get it?" Ira asked Nellie one evening, watching George explain something at high volume to a very patient James. "I think," Nellie said thoughtfully, "it might be me Pratt's influence." This seemed plausible. Me Pratt had taken an immense shine to George from his first week alive, and visited with a regularity that meant he spent a great deal of his early months in the company of her laugh. The years moved in that particular way that full years move, which is to say with simultaneity. There is always something difficult and something beautiful happening at the same time, and the task is to hold both. Dr. Wellman retired in 1881, formally, for the second time, having attempted a first retirement that had lasted 4 months before the territory's medical needs brought him back. His second retirement was more complete, and he spent the next 2 years reading and arguing with Ira about history, and occasionally consulting for Nellie on complicated cases, which she accepted with gratitude and professional seriousness. Wellman died in 1883, in his chair in his house on Oak Street, with a book in his lap and his cat beside him, which was precisely the death he had wanted, and which he had mentioned enough times that no one was surprised. Nellie arranged his burial with the same practical care she gave to everything that mattered, and she kept the cat, a large gray animal named Subject, who took up residence in the medical office and was regarded by patients with varying degrees of enthusiasm. She worked through the 1880s, through 3 children and the expanding cattle operation and the ordinary days of their marriage. There were hard things. A difficult birth with a patient in 1882 that weighed on her for months, a case she could not solve despite everything she knew, and the grief that comes with that kind of limitation. A dry year in 1883 that hit the cattle hard and meant a lean winter that tested everything. A dispute with a neighboring rancher who claimed the northern fence line was wrong, which Ira handled with the quiet steadiness he brought to everything, and which was eventually resolved in his favor by the survey records. Through all of it there was the fundamental thing, which was the two of them. Their marriage was not a simple thing, and it was not without friction, and it was not without the hard work that any real partnership requires. They argued. They disagreed on things. There were evenings where Nellie came home from the office carrying a weight that she needed to set down before she could be present, and evenings where Ira came in from the land exhausted and silent and needing her simply to be there. They learned each other's languages for all of it. They paid attention. What they had built between them was built on the original material of it, the coffee cups and the Saturday wood splitting, and the silences that held meaning, and the particular quality of being seen without being interrogated. She had told him everything, eventually, just as she had told him she would. Everything about Missouri and Clyde Farrow and her father's death and the stage ride, and the 3 days it had taken her to stop flinching whenever a man came through a door. She had told him everything over the course of months and then years, not all at once but in the way of genuine trust, which is gradual and then suddenly complete. And he had listened to all of it the way he had listened from the first, without alarm and without judgment, and with the absolute attention of someone for whom the person talking is the most important thing in the room. In the fall of 1884, 10 years after their wedding, Ira came home from Hays City with something in his coat pocket that he set on the table when he came in without explanation. Nellie was at the kitchen table with Ruth, who was 6 and doing sums with great seriousness, and she looked up when he came in and then at the small package on the table. "What is that?" she asked. "Open it and see," he said. She reached across the table. It was wrapped in brown paper, and inside the brown paper was a small book. A new Harper's Weekly, which was still in publication, and tucked inside its front cover was a note in Ira's handwriting that said simply, "You are still the most interesting person I have ever met." She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked up at him, standing there in his coat with his hat still on, watching her with those dark, honest eyes. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he agreed. "You brought me a Harper's Weekly," she said. "I thought it had a symmetry," he said. She stood up from the table, walked across the kitchen, and kissed him in the way that still, after 10 years, made him feel like the luckiest man in Kansas. Ruth made a sound of theatrical disgust from the table and went back to her sums. James, who was 8, came through the kitchen door from the yard at that moment, sized up the situation and said, with the philosophical resignation of an oldest child, "They are doing it again." "Go back outside," Ira told him, still holding Nellie. James went back outside. George, 4 years old, came in through the same door 30 seconds later, walked directly past his parents as though their embrace were a perfectly ordinary feature of the kitchen geography, and took a biscuit from the tin on the shelf. "There is a very large beetle outside," he announced to no one in particular, and left again. Nellie laughed against Ira's shoulder. "Our children," she said. "Our extraordinary, peculiar children," he agreed. She pulled back enough to look at him. Her face was 40 years old now, the green eyes a little crinkled at the corners, the dark hair she had always pinned with such care now occasionally coming down around her face. She was more herself than she had ever been, more fully inhabited in her own skin, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I was afraid," she said, "for a very long time that I had used up the part of me that could trust anyone. That what had been done had made something in me permanently closed." She held his eyes. "You are the reason that was not true. I need you to know that." He held her face in his hands. "Nellie," he said. "I mean it literally," she said. "I want you to know it." "I know it," he said. "And you are the reason that I have a home that is a home and not just a house and a piece of land. I want you to know that." She pressed her forehead to his, and they stood there for a moment in their kitchen with the fire going and their 3 children orbiting them like planets, and the tall grass moving in the October wind outside the window. The years that followed the 10th anniversary moved with the particular beauty of years that are good in the way that has stopped being surprising and has become simply the texture of existence. Ira and Nellie Turner became the kind of couple who are a fixture of a community, not because they were prominent or powerful, but because they were known, because their presence meant something steady and honest and certain in a place where those qualities were always being tested. James grew into a quiet, capable young man who took to the land with the same instinctive understanding his grandfather had shown, and who announced at 17 that he intended to expand the herd and the operation, and that he had specific plans for doing it, which he presented to his father with such thorough preparation that Ira simply said, "When do you want to start?" Ruth became, to no one's great surprise, a doctor. She began following her mother to the office at 9 years old, and by 12 was assisting in procedures that most adults found alarming, with the focused calm of someone doing exactly what they were made to do. She left for Kansas City at 18 to study properly, with her mother's complete encouragement and her father's considerable financial support, and wrote home letters that were long and detailed and occasionally contained observations about her professors that made Nellie laugh until she had to put the letter down. George remained the loudest and most sociable Turner by a considerable margin, and found his particular gift in trade. He had a natural ease with people that made him extraordinarily good at negotiation and commerce, and he went into the general store business with the son of the man who ran the feed store, which meant that Graves himself was technically his business partner's father, a fact that Nellie found quietly satisfying. Wellman's medical practice, under Nellie's management, and eventually under her teaching of several younger practitioners who came through the territory, became something that people pointed to when they talked about what Hays City had done right in its growing years. She was 62 years old when she formally reduced her practice. Not retired, just reduced, because retiring entirely was not something she was willing to do until her hands required it, and her hands held steady for years. Ira's land was his until his last good year, which was a very good year. He ran cattle for 3 decades and the land rewarded him, and the quarter section his father had homesteaded in 1867 became a proper ranch, named, at Nellie's suggestion, the oak rise for the tree on the east slope that had been there when everything else was prairie. They sat on the porch of the house they had built together on a summer evening in the late 1890s, the light going gold over the tall grass, the distant low sound of cattle carrying on the warm air. James's family was in the new house he had built on the north side of the property. Ruth was in Kansas City with a practice of her own. George was in town. Nellie was reading. He was watching the light. After a while she put her book down and looked at what he was looking at, which was the same thing he always looked at from this porch, the land running out in every direction and the sky above it and the oak tree dark against the orange light. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I am thinking it turned out well," he said. She considered this. "You are not wrong." He looked at her. She had her reading glasses on and her hair was silver white now and her face was the face he knew best in the world, every line of it. "I think about that day in the street sometimes," he said. "When the stage came in," she smiled. It was a different smile from the one she'd had at the beginning, fuller, more inhabited. "You crossed the street very fast," she said. "You were on the ground," he said. "You had 3 strides," she said. "I counted." He laughed, which was one of those full, unhurried laughs that came naturally to people who had spent a long time being genuinely happy. 3 strides, he said. "If you had taken 4, I might have gotten up before you reached me, and that would have been a very different story," she said. "I was not going to give you the chance," he said. She looked at him, those green eyes still clear, still direct, still the color of river water. "No," she said, "you were not." She reached across and put her hand in his, and they sat on the porch together while the light moved across the Kansas sky in all its immensity, and the tall grass moved in the warm wind, and the oak tree stood on the east rise exactly where it had always stood, a landmark from the old world holding its place in the new one. James's children could be heard somewhere in the distance, 2 of them, a boy and a girl, in some kind of disagreement that was rapidly becoming a game. The sounds of the ranch carried on the evening air, the routine sounds of cattle and horses, and the creak of the windmill, and the particular voice of a place that had been tended with care for a long time. Nellie squeezed his hand once. He squeezed back. The light went gold and then amber and then the particular blue dark of a Kansas summer evening, and they sat together in it, and it was enough, more than enough. It was the full and ordinary and extraordinary thing that good lives are made of, and they knew it, both of them, and did not take it for granted for a single moment. Somewhere along the east rise, the oak tree's shadow stretched long across the grass. The garden along the south wall of the house was in its late summer abundance, the climbing beans heavy on the eastern fence, the kitchen herbs dark and fragrant, and along the border nearest the house, exactly as she had planted them 20-odd years before, the flowers that were not practical but that she had intended to have anyway. She still had them. She still tended them, every year without fail. Ira Turner looked at his wife on their porch in the last light of an evening that was like most evenings, which is to say it was irreplaceable, and he thought that the 3 strides across that muddy October street in 1873 were the best 3 strides he had ever taken in his life. He thought about saying this. She looked over at him as though she had heard him thinking. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, "just glad." She looked at him for a moment with those clear green eyes. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he rested his cheek on the top of her head, and they watched the last of the light fall across the Kansas prairie. And the stars, when they came, were enormous overhead, the same stars they had always been, as old as anything and entirely indifferent to human happiness except that they were beautiful to look at. And on the porch of the house on the east rise, Ira and Nellie Turner looked at them together and were glad.